So on the one hand, we're talking about learning, and on the other, we're talking about this issue of ubiquity or embeddedness or wearable computing. So let's start out by talking a little bit about, when I'm talking about learning, I talked about it in that short piece a bit, and I mentioned this guy, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who has this book that isn't that widely read, strangely. His other stuff is read. In particular, this is read, The Social Contract. And The Social Contract, you all know what this is. You remember it from, hopefully, from your undergraduate days in a poli-sci class or a philosophy class, this idea that we behave and we don't behave like animals. One of my professors, great professor, Mark Petrarca at University of California at Irvine, demonstrated the social contract by standing in front of the class and stripping during a normal lecture. He was a very, I can't imagine anyone actually doing that in a social environment, but he's a very formal professor, and always, and this is in California, always wore a jacket and tie to teach in. And he started off by just taking off his jacket and then taking off his tie, which we all thought was very strange, and then stripped down to his skivvies, in order to demonstrate to us that we had this unwritten contract, which was professors should remain clothed while teaching. This is a weird guy. He also staged a terrorist attack on the classroom and did some other interesting things in order to. I mean, it was an 8 a.m. class, and you got to do something at 8 a.m. Anyway, the social contract is this basic idea that we engage in a contract, an unwritten, a tacit contract, so that society can work. And people like John Locke feed out of this, and this is where we get this idea that if we're in an authoritarian system, we have the right and the obligation to overthrow it and kind of cancel the contract. Like, authoritarian governments are like bad cell phone companies. That's the basic gist. Fewer people read Emile or On Education. And Emile is a fun book. My wife and I are thinking about kids, and she doesn't like the idea that I'm taking my child rearing advice from a guy who liked basic nature and had some really weird ideas at the time. Those ideas were split. He said basically development was split into a bunch of phases. That early on you had babies, and I kind of skipped, who cares about babies? Skipped over the baby part. But from 0 to 5, you have to take care of their basic needs and give them an environment in which they can become physically strong. From 5 to 12, this is again Petrarca. I didn't realize until I was just talking about this how much Petrarca really had an impact on me. Not just because he was naked in front of 200 people, but just because of his ideas. This may not have been Petrarca, I'm thinking of it. One of his ideas was you go to the park and you pay off the fastest runners in the park to throw a race by giving them Twinkies. Mind you, this is education for Emile, who's an upper class sort of gentility in France, and so you go to the park, you find some ruffians, and you throw a race so that he has the self-confidence to think that he can actually win things. You do things like you, again, go out for a walk with him, and then you drop him in the bushes somewhere where it's pretty clear that he'll be able to find his way home, but just abandon him so that he can, again, make use of his own orienteering skills to feel as if he's developing this self-confidence. You go out and as he's getting a little bit older, towards 10 or 11, you go out and fly kites, and then you tell him to mark out where the shadow is on the kite, and you get to start to teach him about geometry without him ever knowing that he's learning about geometry. A lot of these ideas that right now seem like, oh, well, that makes sense. In fact, if any of you have kids or went through the Montessori system, a lot of this probably sounds familiar. Montessori drew a lot from this idea, along with Piaget. Piaget more directly, but Piaget, through Piaget to Maria Montessori, you had this idea of kind of putting your hands on things and experiencing directly in order to learn. The next phase, from 12 to 15, and this was really revolutionary at the time, especially for the gentility, was he suggested that you become an apprentice, not this kind of apprentice, this kind of apprentice, that you learn a trade. And this was really unusual because At the time, education consisted of going very quickly into theological and philosophical education. And he said from that period, from 12 to 15, even if, and it was obvious that these people were not going to become tradesmen, even without that, you learned so much in the process of learning a physical, trade, something where you use your hands in order to construct something, that connects that hands-on stuff that you were learning until you were 12 with this kind of beginnings of a theoretical idea of why things happen the way they should happen. So this was really important to him, this idea of learning a trade. From there, I don't have there's two more phases. From 15 to 20, he says you should then kind of begin to talk about theology and faith and question your own faith and have someone around that can help him question his faith. And from 20 on, it's all about getting married and then educating your wife. So maybe it's a little dated in that respect. Actually, to be fair to Rousseau, the idea that you would actually afford education to a woman at all was fairly revolutionary at the time. And it was
educating her to his means.
Well, part of it was that. Part of it was educating her, actually educating her as the primary educator for the next child. So it was certainly self-serving, but again, it was a step forward. So we could either damn or praise, depending on perspective. Jean Piaget, as I mentioned, took off from this idea and said there were these, and this is moving forward by a couple hundred years, that there were these developmental stages: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. Some of you, if any of you have taken the basic developmental stuff, this looks very familiar. All of this constructs what is usually called a constructivist approach to learning. And I think one of your readings at least briefly touched on this idea of a constructivist approach as opposed to an objectionist approach or the standard instructional process. And what it says is that you remember our communication models where there's a sender, a code, a receiver, this doesn't work. What we're doing right now doesn't work. Me taking knowledge out of my head and forcing it down your throats, or opening up your skull caps and kind of dropping it in. That's just not a model. The only way people learn is by doing things and constructing their own knowledge. And so that's the basic kind of core that comes out of this.